Okay, we're going to get started. We've currently got 24 attendees. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Maybe we'll get a few more as the session goes on. We're really excited to have you joining us today. We've got a whole bunch of people involved in this live session, including a team out in the field and some other guest speakers here at the Banfield Marine Sciences Center. So welcome to Virtual Field Trip Land. My name is Owen. We'll introduce you to the rest of the team in a second. First things first, very important that we acknowledge the territory from which this live session is coming from. So here at the BMSC and out where our field team are, we're broadcasting to you from the traditional territory of the Hawaiian First Nation, who have territory all along kind of the southeast coast of Barkley Sound, and I'll show you where that is on Google Earth in a second. So the Hawaiian First Nation have lived and been caretakers of this land since time immemorial. They're one of the 15 Channel nations on the west coast of Vancouver Island here, and they're actually one of 5 nations governed by the Manilth Treaty, a modern treaty nation. So very grateful to be on this territory and showing you some really cool things. So as I said before, my name is Owen. We are BMSC Live, the Banfield Marine Sciences Center. The Banfield Marine Sciences Center is a shared campus of the 5 large universities in Western Canada. So University of Victoria, University of British Columbia, University of Alberta, University of Calgary, and Simon Fraser University. But we've been accepting students and researchers from all over the world, not just those 5 universities, for over 50 years now. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary last summer. So we're really stoked here to be presenting as a part of Science Odyssey, put on by NSERC, and actually our program here is funded by NSERC as well. So big thank you to NSERC Promo Science. And we would like this session to be as interactive as possible, so you can interact with us through the webinar chat function. To save bandwidth, because our team is broadcasting from the field, we don't have our participants we don't give our attendees audio or video, but you can ask us questions in the chat, and our team will ask you some questions throughout this session as well, and you can answer those in the chat. So I'll be monitoring the chat here from the lab at the BMSC, and our team out in the field will also be monitoring the chat there. So just to test that, why don't you let us know where you are tuning in from using that chat function. We'll see how widespread our audience is today. And while you're doing that, I'm going to take a moment to show you more precisely where both myself and our field team are today. Oh, I might have to change the settings here. Panelists, we want to make sure everyone can use the chat function with everyone else. So I've just changed the settings here. Maybe now let's give the chat function a try. There we go. So we've got people tuning in from Richmond, from Souk, Victoria, Abbotsford, Vancouver, Victoria, Calgary. Someone from Toronto, from the eastern side, Comox in Calgary, Prince George, Nova Scotia. Someone from Banfield, awesome. Just look close by, UBC, Victoria. Great. So lots of focus here in Western Canada, but a couple of people from further afield as well, which is really, really cool. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to use Google Earth to show you where our team is. So here we go. So hopefully this part of planet Earth is somewhat familiar to you all. As we zoom in here a little bit on North America, we start to see British Columbia and Alberta. So many of you might already know where the Banfield Marine Sciences Center is already, but just in case you don't, we are located out here on the west coast of Vancouver Island. You can actually see it says Banfield right there. And most people get here either by driving on a logging road from Port Alberni that goes all the way along here, or by taking a boat from Port Alberni as well. And so here in Banfield, this big body of water here is known as Barkley Sound, and the Hawaiian First Nations have territory all along this side, Barkley Sound, including some of these islands out here. So as we get a little bit closer, the town of Bamfield is right here, split in half by Bamfield Inlet. Right now, I'm sitting at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center right over here. However, our team, who are out in the field, went out on a boat this morning, and they drove all the way across what's called Trevor Channel here, out in between Diana Island and these little islands here, Haynes Island. And they've come through Dodger Channel and around the corner into this bay here. So they're kind of in between Edward King Island, Haynes Island, and Seppings Island. So that team, which I'm going to send you out to introduce themselves in a minute, they're kind of right in this little area here. So I'll zoom back out just to kind of show where that is in context with Bamfield. So they left Bamfield on boat. They're out here. They have some really, really cool stuff to show you out there. So without further ado, let's send you over to the field team. Okay, over to you, April.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So like Owen said, my name is Avril. I'm one of the educators here at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center, and I am coming from you live on a boat. You can kind of see it behind me. We actually have another boat rafted up here. So we are right in the middle of this bay trying to find you some kelp to look at. So I'm just going to turn you around and introduce you to the rest of my team. They are all on the boat with me as well, helping to keep the boat steady and also to drive our fancy little underwater robot. So this is Carolyn right here in the funny black box. Yeah, that's so that she can see the screen of our little robot that's out there. It's kind of like a drone, but underwater. It's swimming through instead of flying in the air. And it's out in the kelp forest there, waiting to show you all about the kelp. You can kind of see some bubbles if you have really, really good eyes. Also on the boat today is Phil. Phil is helping us to make sure that our ROV stays safe and not tangled in anything, and also just to make sure that our boat is all safe as we are doing all of this live broadcasting for you. And you've already met Owen back in the lab, and we'll be joined a little bit later today by 3 members of the Kelp Rescue Initiative projects that we have going on here in Bamfield. So we'll hear from Clay Steele, Lauren Dykman, and Grace Melchers in a little bit. But first, we're going to go and take a look under the water at what Carolyn's looking at. So Owen will help me share the screen of the ROV so you'll get to see what we're looking at here. Okay, yeah, so it's a little bit hard to see, but that's just because there's some plankton in the water right now. Oh, look at all those fish. Those look like pile perch to me. I can tell they're pile perch because they have a big bar going down the side of their body. It might not be quite as clear to you, but there's a couple good shots. And kelp forests are really, really important for our schools of fish. They're actually a really important ecosystem out here in Bamfield and all along the west coast of Canada. Has anybody ever heard of kelp forest before? Is kelp forest a new term you've never heard of before? Let us know if anybody knows about kelp forests already. Yeah, there's a couple. That's good. I'm glad to hear that some people have heard about it before. We're looking to tell you just a little bit more about it. We've done a couple live labs before to tell people about kelp, but today we're looking at the ecology a little bit more, so the kelp forest and why it's important. So kelp forests are similar to our forests on land in a lot of ways. So I'll ask you guys again another question. Why are forests on land, our terrestrial forests, so important? Are there any things that they do for the animals, any things that they do for humans that are really important? Why do we like our forests? Habitat, yeah, that's a really great one. Any others? Oxygen, yeah, huge thing that our forests provide for us. Yeah, and food. So those are quite a few of the things that we're looking for in our land forests, and they're the same under the water. So when we're looking at ocean ecosystems, kelp forests really help us with those things. They're a good place for fish and invertebrates to hide in. Also, seals and sea lions get shelter there. Lots of things like to live there. And then they also provide us oxygen because they're photosynthesizers. Just like our plants on land, our algae underwater helps us to photosynthesize. And then, of course, lots of things like to eat kelp. Humans like to eat kelp too. Some of you might have tried it before. And When I'm saying kelp, have you guys heard those terms? I know if some of you have taken university courses, you might know what a kelp is, but if you haven't, kelp is a group of seaweeds. So seaweeds can be grouped into 3 different color groups. You can have reds, browns, and greens, and kelp is in the brown group. So we're looking at seaweeds that are brown in color. And it also happens that these brown seaweeds tend to be our largest seaweeds that we get. Yeah, thanks Debbie for helping out with that definition for if anybody missed it too. So kelps are our brown seaweeds, very good. It's nice to have a review too, but I'm glad to know that some of you also know a lot about seaweeds. So when we are looking at these kelp forests, they are some of our most dynamic ecosystems on the planet. They have to withstand the wave action, and also they tend to change a lot from season to season. So in the winter, these kelp forests that we're seeing, and right now we're looking at more blue ocean and kind of what's in the water, but there we go, there's some more kelp. All of this kelp will have died off in the winter, and it won't look even remotely like this. Most of the kelp forests don't keep anything like our trees keep. They don't keep a big stem, they don't keep habitat like that. They die off seasonally, and then they'll come back in the spring. And these species, especially some of our big forest creating kelps, can grow up to 1 foot a day. So that is a ton of growth that they put out in the spring. They just send out all of their leaves, which we call blades, up towards the surface where they photosynthesize, because they need to be attached to the bottom in order to stay put. Otherwise, they'd be flushed away by the heavy waves. Yeah, so we have 2 main kinds of kelp that produce these really, really big forest canopy layers. We have bull kelp and giant kelp. And it just so happens we'll be looking a little bit more at that a little bit later on with Clay and the rest of the Kelp Rescue team. So today, as you've probably realized, our title of our show is Kelp Help. So I'm also going to tell you a little bit of the issues we're facing with our kelp forest right now, because they are really, really great systems, but they're in a little bit of trouble, which is why we need to be helping out the kelp. So these systems are, and if you've been to Bamfield or any part of the west coast of Canada, you might notice they're really cold water systems. So everything that lives in the kelp forest really likes it to be cold. They've adapted to live in cold water, not warm water. Just like if you put a polar bear in the desert, it would probably be sad. If you put kelp in really warm water, it's also very sad. So throughout climate change and different areas of our recent past, we've seen that waters are warming globally. So that has been an issue for kelp all over the place. But specifically in BC, we had a problem around 2013, 2014, where we had an underwater heat wave come through. There was a big blob of really hot water. Ooh, there's some beautiful pile perch again. Good shot, Carolyn. Yeah, this blob of hot water came through and it really stressed out our kelp. And it just so happened that we also coincided with a year that was meant to be warmer anyways. So some of you might have heard of El Nino and La Nina years. Those are basically the ways we tell patterns of warmer years versus cooler years, years with more precipitation and less. So this year, the couple of years that are of issue were supposed to be El Nino years, which are generally warmer. So we're seeing warmer water anyways. And then a heat wave came through and stressed out all of our kelps. So that was the first issue that happened, and it really hurt a lot of the populations. Then on top of that, we had a problem with predation, which some of you might have heard about before. Does anybody know what in our waters eats kelp? One of the most voracious foragers of kelp, something that really, really eats a lot of it. Urchins, yeah, you guys got it. Sea urchins are a really, really big predator of kelps. And in a healthy ecosystem underwater, sea urchins can just eat the kelp blades, the leaves, that fall onto the ocean floor. But there weren't enough predators of the urchins. So there was a lot of urchins happening all underwater. Nothing was eating the urchins. And so they kind of had too much population to just eat the kelp leaves that fell off. So they started eating all of the kelp, the whole thing. Yeah, and I see someone in the comments got right where I'm going to. So The thing that usually eats sea urchins is actually sea otters. So not river otters. We see a lot of river otters, but sea otters are a little bit different. They like to live out at sea. There are marine mammals, and they are quite a bit bigger actually than sea otter or than river otters. So humans really, really liked sea otter pelts a long time ago when we were doing fur trades and things like that. We hunted all of the otters almost all the way to extinction. So we definitely took all of them out of the west coast of Vancouver Island, and there was none left to eat all those happy little urchins. Oh, Owen says he has a video of urchins to see. Yeah, let's see maybe an urchin barren. An urchin barren is an area that all of the urchins have eaten the kelp off of. So there you can see where the kelp would have been. It looks like an area that should have had kelp before, but the urchins ate it all. Our urchins also had another predator. So we took all of the sea otters out a long time ago, but luckily we're putting them back now. We're helping to move them around so that hopefully we can have more healthy populations of sea otters. The other thing that had a big impact on our urchin population was something called a sunflower sea star. Oh, look at all those urchins. Those are red urchins in the video that Owen is showing you, and there's tons of them. You can imagine that if one leaf of the kelp fell to the forest floor, that would not even feed 3 of them. And you can see so many here. So that's why they started eating all the kelp. So back to our sunflower sea stars. They are a really, really cool species. They kind of look like a sunflower. That's why they're named like that. They have a lot of legs, not just 5. Most of our sea stars only have 5 legs, but these ones grow many, and they're really, really good predators. Yeah, look at all those urchins. Wow, good video, Owen. I think this is some dive footage from our scientific diver on station, Siobhan. She takes some great footage, and it's a really good example of what the issues we're seeing underwater are right now. These sunflower stars that I was talking about before, they would also eat the urchins. So they would eat these happy little underwater pin cushions, and they would they would rip them open, and they were so big and so strong that it wasn't even a problem for them. Because I saw in the comments someone said they're really, really spiky. They're punk. Yeah, they are punk. They're spiky because it acts as protection. So not very many things can eat them. That's why it was so important that otters were around and sunflower stars were around. The sunflower stars, however, were unfortunately, they were taken, their population took a big hit with that hot water bubble as well. So their population was really stressed out when the water turned really, really warm. And so they got a lot more diseases, and a lot of their population fell off. And there was then no predators of the urchins. Oh, I saw someone ask if it hurts when you touch the urchins. No, it doesn't hurt too much when you touch them. You just have to be kind of careful. You pick them up carefully, and it might hurt if you step all your weight on it, but it probably wouldn't be too bad. But we pick them up a lot of the time in the science center because they have to move from tank to tank. So you can pick them up. And I saw another question about a native name for urchins. Do you mean a scientific name or an indigenous, like Huayet name? Oh, sorry, it's about the sunflower fish. Yes, they are native to the area. Yeah, they tended to live here, and they could get up to 1 meter in diameter. They were huge. And now we only see them to be about palm size. So the population is still struggling with how warm the water is, and that disease that got introduced called wasting disease, or got worsened as the waters got warmer. Yeah, look at all those urchins. It's really hard to control them when we don't have those predators around. Cool videos, Owen. Thank you for sharing those. So that was a little bit doom and gloom. I know you guys have heard me talking a lot about the problems in the kelp forest, but luckily today we've found some panelists who are going to help us by showing a little bit of the projects they're doing to help restore the kelp forests. So humans have really impacted them and made it so that the kelp forests are disappearing, but Clay and Lauren and Grace are from Kelp Rescue, and they're working on projects to help actually replant our kelp forests. So I'll pass it over to them to give a better description of what they're doing.
Thanks, April, and hello, everyone. My name is Clay Steele, and I work with the Kelp Rescue Initiative.
My name's Grace, and I also work with Kelp Rescue.
Yeah, so I'll just get started by talking a little bit about who we are and what we do. The Kelp Rescue Initiative started here in Banfield in 2021 with the goal of advancing science on the restoration and conservation of kelp forests. Like Averill mentioned, a lot of kelp forests along this coast are in trouble. They're disappearing in some places. They're becoming smaller in many other places. So ultimately, we're interested in understanding how to do habitat restoration with kelp forests. And I was interested in the audience how familiar people are with this idea of habitat restoration. Is it something you've heard of or know of examples in places that you live? I'll just give people a sec if anyone wants to put the chat in there. It's something that has been done for more ecosystems. There's been a lot of science developed on it for a lot of ecosystems on land, but in the ocean, it's a much newer kind of science. So people haven't been trying for as long, and there's less information out there about how to do it successfully. And that's the case with kelp forests. It's still a fairly new idea, trying to restore kelp forests where they've disappeared. And so that's kind of at the end of the day what we're all working towards. So yeah, I guess I'll just April did a really good job describing why the kelp are in trouble in general. It's getting too hot in a lot of places, especially in some parts of BC coast. It's warmer than a lot of other places in the North Pacific, particularly in the Salish Sea between Vancouver and Vancouver Island. They have these imbalances in their ecosystem that have led in many places to sea urchins becoming too heavy of a grazer with the kelp forests. So one of the things we're doing is trying to understand where the kelp is doing well and where it's not doing well. That is a big challenge here in BC. There's over 60,000 kilometers of coastline in BC due to all of the islands and fjords and inlets we have. So it's a lot of habitat for kelp, but it's also really difficult to keep track of all of it. So local knowledge becomes really important in that. That includes the traditional knowledge of First Nations along the coast. But I was also just interested that there was a lot of people who mentioned they're from BC or they're living in coastal BC. Has anyone seen kelp forests close to where they live, and has anyone actually noticed places where they might not be anymore? I can come back to that if people want to put that in the chat. But it's if you ask around, you can often find people who are out in the water or spend time on the beaches, and they might say, yeah, there was a kelp forest there 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and it's not there anymore. So we're hearing that more and more, unfortunately, as the climate warms. In the Kitimat region, interesting. And so we're working in southern BC right now. We're based here in Banfield. We're also doing, we started here in Banfield, but since 2021, we've expanded to do restoration projects in Tsleil-Waututh territory, in Vancouver and Burrard Inlet. So we have a restoration project happening there. We're also working in Comox territory off of Hornby Island, and in Namgis territory in the Broughton Archipelago. So we haven't made it up to the Kitimat region yet, but there's coast-wide losses of kelp happening, and we're trying to understand where that's occurring. We're also doing a lot of research on their genetics to understand if certain populations might be more adapted to the kind of conditions that kelp's experiencing now due to climate change and these ecosystem changes. So understanding their DNA and their genes might help us understand how to bring them back better. And so using those lessons of where kelp is doing well and what their genetics are like, we're also trying to test these restoration techniques. And so I'll pass it over to Grace and Lauren in a few minutes to talk more about that. But yeah, we're also doing this this restoration because it's a relatively new kind of science, and there's a lot of questions we don't know the answers to about what makes kelp restoration successful. So yeah, I think, sorry. Yeah, so actually, yeah, Grace just reminded me, we have a few pictures to show you here. We can just share our screen in a sec. You might have to escape out of it and then start there. Yeah, so in the North Pacific in general, some parts of the coast have lost over 90% of the kelp forests in an area. It's usually pretty localized. And like I said, it can be challenging to understand where kelp is actually growing at a big coastal level. So I don't know, can anyone confirm among the panelists whether they can see what we're sharing, this map? Yeah, great. So I'll pass it over to Grace here in a sec, but this is just a map showing where kelp forests, where we knew that there were healthy kelp forests a number of years ago. I don't remember the cutoff year, but this was kind of before that recent warm period in 2013 to 2014 occurred. And this is where we knew kelp forests were historically. And then after that warm period a couple of years ago, one sec, I'm just trying to change the map here. There we go. So if you can see those red dots up on the screen now, those are places where kelp has started, where the kelp has disappeared. So this is since 2014. There used to be kelp at those sites in the red dots, and now there isn't anymore. And so we want to understand how we can do habitat restoration in those places with the red dots. And to do that, we're doing a pilot restoration there now that Lauren, who's one of the panelists, can tell you about in a few minutes. But we're also doing it in the site that Averill is at today, which is a place where kelp is doing pretty well, all things considered, because we want to understand what a good condition is like for them to grow. And this is just yeah, there's kind of in Barkley Sound here where Bamfield is, and where you're seeing the ROV footage today. It gets a little bit cooler the closer you are to the open coast, and a little bit warmer the further up in the sound you go. But that little difference is just enough to cause the kelp forest to disappear in some places. Grace, can I pass it over to you now? And you can talk about the rest. Yeah.
So I'm curious to know, I don't think we can see the chat in presenter view like this with our PowerPoint going, but I'm curious to know, oh, maybe we can. If you're interested in kind of figuring out how we get the kelp restored in terms of how it goes from being grown in a lab, which is what we do here. Yes, okay, amazing. To back out in the ocean. So it's kind of this cyclical process that goes on, because we first start by, let me see if my PowerPoint is going to work. Oh, maybe not. There we go. So we first start by collecting kelp out in the field. And so this is our first step in restoring kelp. So this is a field of bull kelp. All those little dots in the water are the air sacs that help bull kelp float to the top. And that is what a very healthy bull kelp forest looks like. So that's one kind of kelp that we're working on restoring. And then this is a giant kelp forest. So it looks a little bit different, but you can spot them pretty easily along the coast. So we go into those forests and we collect what we will call, for this, it's a little bit more complicated than just seeds, but we'll call them seeds for today. And this is what they look like. So this is from a bull kelp. So we're working on giant kelp in Bamfield, restoring giant kelp, but this is an example of some seeds that are from a bull kelp. So we collect these seeds and then we bring them back to our laboratory and we grow them for a little bit, and then we'll blend them up. And funnily enough, we use a kitchen blender, just like what you have in your own kitchen. So we blend these seeds up and then we put them into basically these tiny little pieces. into these tiny little pieces, and then we put them into a spray bottle and we spray them onto these rocks. And the hope is that all of these tiny little pieces of kelp will then grow and attach onto these rocks. And then we can put these rocks into the ocean. So what happens next is the rocks go from not looking like they have anything on it, but really they do have really, really tiny little pieces of kelp, to tiny pieces of kelp that you can see sometimes with a microscope, and then they grow a little bit more. And then they become huge pieces of kelp. So we have a few of these pieces of gravel still left in our tanks. This was taken a few days ago, and you can see some of these blades are like this big now, so they can grow quite a bit. But before they get too big, we want to plant them in the ocean so that they can grow in their natural ecosystem. So we go from taking these bigger tanks of kelp and putting them into little smaller containers, and we actually pile these into a truck and drive them down to the water, which is kind of funny. So these are all of the tanks full of water, and then we load them into a boat. And then our divers, so this is Clay and Lauren who are on the call today, our divers then go under the water and they will plant the kelp into their little plots. You could also drop these little rocks off of a boat too. But in this experiment in Bamfield, we place them, Clay and Lauren place them in the water. And then this is sort of what it looks like as the kelp is dropping down and as divers are placing them under the water. Hopefully that video is coming through okay for everybody. And then that's Clay placing some rocks full of gravel and kelp. And then there's some of it swaying in the water. So hopefully today we'll be able to see some more of it. But yeah, that is everything on my end. So now you know how the kelp has gotten out there. And Lauren, if you had anything else to add about our experiment, pass it over to you.
Great. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Dykman. I'm a postdoc with Kelp Rescue Initiative and based at UVic for a lot of the time. So I've been going out with Clay and Grace, and we've been working on designing this experiment so that we can actually answer some questions about how to best outplant this green gravel that we just talked about growing. So do any of you have an idea of things we might want to ask if we're like conducting a research experiment? We put the gravel out, and then what might we want to do over time to sort of like tell if it's doing well? Anyone have any ideas? Yeah, so I see a question. Yeah, photo documentation. That's definitely what stuff that we've been doing. Measuring growth after a time period. That's very good. So that is that's something that we've done a month ago, and we're actually going to go back out next week and sort of visit these same sites that are on video right now and monitor the growth. So these are all really important things with restoration, is to not just do the restoration, but then document a before and after. Have you actually made an impact? So with our experiment, you might be noticing there's some bags in the water that someone asked a question about earlier. And these are really brightly colored bags that we filled with gravel to be heavy. And we've put them on the seafloor to sort of mark out plots. And that is the area where we have put down our green gravel. And the reason they're brightly colored is you see it's not the best visibility in the water throughout the year. So we want to be able to find these again. So those are going to mark our experimental plots for the summer. And then whenever the experiment's over, we'll go do a lot of dives to clean them up and hopefully have a kelp forest at the end. So we've had a lot of really good responses. We do want to measure their growth after a time period so we can compare. And we're actually looking at kelp from different locations. So we took some kelp from a warm site, some kelp from a cool site, and we've sort of like swapped them around to see if the warm kelp is performing better overall, if it like out survives the cool kelp in the warmer site. And we've been looking at their survivorship. So we're trying to see how many kelps actually grow out of the number of gravels that we put out there. So I have a few videos that I can share, if I can share screen real quick. So one of them is to just give you an idea of what some of these surveys by scuba look like. And this is our great dive safety officer, Siobhan. She is going around. Can I just get a confirmation that folks can actually see this video? All right, looking good. So yeah, this is our dive safety officer, Siobhan, the last time we went out to monitor, and we're going out with little rulers and just putting them next to the baby kelps, and we're measuring a certain number of kelps from every plot. So this gives you an idea of what the scuba work looks like. And this video was taken by our wonderful lab manager, Christina Tijan. And then we just have a few more videos to show some of the really awesome marine creatures that we see underwater. You know, while we're surveying around, we'll take note of some of these awesome animals. So one of my favorites, because I really like snails, this is called a moon snail. So we saw this guy cruising along the floor. And this snail is about, I would say about the size of between a baseball and a football. And then the final video I'm going to show is just some of our successful green gravel. And this was when it was somewhat young. So we were seeing it being about 5 centimeters long, 5 centimeters to 10 centimeters. But as the video zooms along, and once again, Christina's taking this, you see this white rock here with a little kelp growing on it. And as we cruise along, we'll see other white rocks. So they're a little hard to see. And that's why we go down with divers, because even with the ROV, it's sort of hard to see these individual rocks, but the divers can get right up against it with their face. And then we take all of our scientific notes on a dive slate with a pencil, because that works underwater. And then we come back to the surface and we can analyze all of those notes back in the lab when we are nice and warm and dry.
Thanks for that, Lauren. Yeah, it's really cool to be looking at the plots we have growing out there right now. Carolyn, I'm wondering if you could try to get a little bit closer to the seafloor. You might be able to make out which of the kelp is the stuff that we put there, and then which might be wild kelp. Because there's certainly some wild species that are growing there I can see, but I think I also see some of the species that that we put in, the giant kelp. Yeah, it's really cool to be all warm and dry in the lab right now, and still get a sight into our experiments. So we do have these urchins coming up, which is kind of one of the things we were a little concerned about. Obviously, urchins are one of the things that's being hard on kelp in the wild right now, and so we knew that it was a risk putting our green gravel out there. So those white rocks, those are ones that used to have kelp on it but don't anymore, and I can safely assume that the urchins probably ate it because there's a bunch right there. So that's, but that's, even though that's, it didn't make it this far, that's still science. We're learning what makes successful kelp restoration and unsuccessful. So when we go back to measure that plot, we'll have an idea what about that plot might have made it a place where the kelp didn't survive that we put out. So someone a little while ago asked about, are there urchins in this kelp forest? So as we can see, there are. And something I just wanted to touch on there was that urchins, even though we talk about them kind of negatively in the context of kelp conservation right now, like they are the thing that's usually causing kelp forests to disappear in many places, they're still a really important part of the ecosystem. And it's really only because of these effects of climate change and ecosystem becoming imbalanced that the urchins are becoming kind of a problem. In a healthy kelp forest, there can be a really high density and a really high number of sea urchins. And then they only really become an issue when the kelp gets stressed out and it can't feed them enough normally. And then that's when the urchins switch from kind of not bothering the kelp, not eating the base of it, to eating the base of it. And then that's what causes the kelp forests to actually get wiped out. So urchins are still a really important part of the ecosystem. And then we need to understand better how they fit into the kelp restoration. Yeah. Carolyn, can you go back to the other plots you're looking at that seem to have some of the kelp remaining in it? I just want to see if we can make out.
I see a sun star there a little
Oh, you do?
lower.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Good.
sort of beneath this urchin.
Yeah,
There's a
yeah.
little baby one. So this is another really hopeful thing, is we were seeing a lot of these baby sunflower stars growing up in our plots, and those are eventually going to be things that eat urchins. So we do see this nice healthy food web sort of building at this site, but a lot of these stars are little babies, and that could still be from the wasting disease that killed a lot of the larger ones many years ago.
Yeah. So for the viewers, it's that little gray thing. It was that little gray thing just below the urchins, and it's only that big right now. But when it's an adult, it can grow to be like this big. They're huge, and they're urchin eating machines. So it's great to see it in the kelp forest coming back. So it looks like the urchins. There's a few in the mix there, but it looks like they haven't made it over to these plots as much. And maybe we can make out where some of the giant kelp that we planted actually is here.
This is why we do the surveys with divers, is even though we can see with the ROV, it's really hard to tell kelp species apart. So there's a lot of just other kelp species that are growing and doing well here, which is also a good sign, because it means the urchins haven't really gotten this far and haven't munched on everything. And it's a good thing for the urchins too, because the reason they overgraze kelp is that they're hungry. Oh, that's
giant
a giant kelp. Yeah,
see that, Lauren? Yeah, that would be one of the kelp we planted. So that's really great to see. So it's got
multiple bulbs.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. Nice work. The last time we went and looked at these kelps in person, they didn't have the gas floats yet. So when the kelps are babies, they just kind of look like a little brown piece of paper. They're just flat and one-dimensional. But then giant kelp, as it grows these gas-filled bladders that help it to float. And then as it floats, it gets closer to the light, and it just grows faster and faster and faster. So it's really encouraging to see how big this one's grown. It's only been about 5 weeks, so it's grown probably 2 or 3 feet in those 5 weeks. And someone mentioned earlier up in the chat that they are one of the fastest growing organisms in the ocean. They can grow up to 1 foot a day at the peak of their growth, which is really cool. So I'm relieved to see that some of our kelp has survived this far, that not all the urchins has eaten it.
We're a bit like parents. We put so much effort into these kelps that we want them to be doing well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Carolyn. I can answer some other questions folks had further up in the chat if now is a good time. Yeah, I don't know. Does anyone have questions about what they're seeing right in front of them before I go back? Like we might be able to zoom in on some things, or Carolyn might be able to look for some things while we're still here.
I did see a leather star not too long ago. That was a pretty big, one of the kinds of sea stars that we have here, and that one has 5 arms, and it's nice and smooth, which is, I think, why people call it a leather star.
Yeah. So something I'll comment on here, which is kind of cool, is that globally there's over 24 species of kelps. So there's a lot of diversity, and Barkley Sound here in Western Vancouver Island is one of the what we call hotspots of kelp biodiversity in the world. That means that it's one of the places in the world where the most number of species of kelps grow. There's over 16 locally here. And over the broader region, there's over 20. So we're only working on 2 species, and we can see some of the other ones that I haven't really talked about as much here. So a lot of these are called sugar kelp, Saccharina. There's also there might be some what we call Pterygophora in this as well. Anyways, there's a lot of cool different varieties of kelp. Some of them we can also eat too. So I don't know if people are fond of seaweed salad. Like that's one of my favorite dishes in Japanese cuisine. But that's from a species of kelp, wakame. That's one of the more commonly eaten kinds of kelp. What's the pink stuff? That's probably an encrusting algae. So it's also it's another kind of algae, but it actually grows kind of like a rock. Yeah. And I think, does someone else have a question further up? Oh, and Lauren just answered it there. How often we
I just
monitor?
answered about how often we monitor, which is about once a month. And then each time we monitor, we take about 3 dive days to make all those measurements for our plots, doing about 2 dives a day. And we have out total 80 plots that we are monitoring.
Yeah, so it's a lot of time spent underwater, a lot of work, but we can get through it in about a week each time.
Yep, and with the idea with green gravel is it's supposed to be really quick and easy for any user to use. The point of it is you're not supposed to need divers. You're supposed to just toss it off a boat, but we're using diving because this isn't just restoration. We're doing an experiment, so we have to actually take really detailed notes on what happens.
Yeah, the idea of putting the kelp seeds on rocks, it's what we call green gravel, and then throwing them off of a boat. That only really kind of began within the last 5 years. So there's not a lot of tests of it yet. So we're using divers to get a much greater insight into how it works and how successful it is. But eventually the hope is that we can scale it up and restore maybe hectares or kilometers of coastline with this technique.
And Clay and Lauren, I know there was a question a little bit ago, and I can't quite remember if you've covered that, but someone asked why we blend up the kelp before we put it on those pieces of gravel instead of just finding the seeds. Can you explain a little bit why we put it all in a blender?
Yeah, for sure. Even putting it in a blender doesn't kill it. It just makes what can grow, it makes the fragments of the kelp, it just makes a lot more of them. So we might go from like a few hundred little baby kelps to tens of thousands, and they still live after the blending. And that means the tens of thousands of little baby kelps, which are really tiny, they're microscopic. We can put those on way more rocks. So and then those all grow into what we're looking at right now, into the adult kelps in the ocean. Yeah.
It looks like we might be seeing some more giant kelp in this plot too.
Yeah, it's true. The stuff with the vertical stuff with the floats, that's probably the giant kelp we put out.
So we have a question on the lab water temperature that we grow our kelps at. And when we grew our kelps, it was winter time, which the water temperature is a lot more to their liking. So that was around, I think, 6 Celsius. And Clay can speak more to the water in the lab, but we were using seawater coming in. So the sites we're planting at are actually very similar in temperature in the winter, and that's a temperature the kelps like. But where the issue comes in is that summer warming that we get. So they tend to get more stressed in the summer, and then the sites can have a lot more different of water temperatures. So it'll be interesting watching our experiments as the year progresses, and the sites are going to get to very different temperatures.
Yeah. So this time we used the same temperature in the lab for the different parts of the experiment. But I think one day it would be really cool to raise different groups of kelp in different temperatures in the lab and then put them out in the wild to see how they grow differently. And so if anyone here is really interested in science or thinking about what they want to do after school, these are the kind of questions that we need people to work on answering. And so there's a lot of opportunity to better understand the kelp's biology and also how we can bring it back better. Yeah. So how deep out are the urchins? This site, the urchins probably only go out to about 30 feet. I don't know, Lauren, if you agree with that. That's kind of been my observation. This is a relatively shallow site, but sea urchins in general can live much deeper. They typically like it where it's shallower though, because that's where all the kelp is growing. And kelp doesn't grow that deep because it needs to be close to where there's light.
Yeah, just like any plants on land, kelp needs to photosynthesize, which some of you might know that term. And that is basically they get their energy and they get enough energy to grow from the sun. So deeper down, the water clarity isn't as good and the sun can't go that far. So that's why our kelp need to grow closer to the shore.
Yeah, you can see plots here with a lot of white gravels. That looks like the urchins got to these ones.
Yeah, that's a shame, but we'll get some interesting data from that, and we'll understand maybe what caused that. We use white rocks to grow the kelp on for this reason exactly. We want to be able to find the rocks again. There's not really white rocks out in the wild, so it was a way to tell the difference between them. A little while ago, someone asked about whether pollution was causing the kelp to disappear in some of these places, and the answer is yes. In some places, pollution can cause declines in kelp. And it can be both the effect of like the pollution itself, like things like heavy metals or chemicals from industry or cities, that kind of thing. And it can also be because sometimes pollution causes algae blooms that just smother the kelp and deprive the oxygen of oxygen and all these other bad things. So pollution is usually a local problem. But what we're seeing with kelp disappearing along the coast is that it's happening in places without any pollution or very little pollution. So it's more certainly an effect of warming temperatures from climate change and from those ecosystem changes, like we talked about with sea urchins and sea otters. Yeah.
And yes, in regards to the question about if you can find urchins on shore of the main island, which I think you mean Vancouver Island, there's lots of urchins everywhere, and sometimes they're a little bit, you can't find them usually at like a low tide, but if you're looking at a very low tide and you can kind of look out and the water's a bit clear, usually you can see some urchins. Or if you're off of a dock, that's often a good spot to look for them. Yeah, they like to hang out in a little bit deeper water rather than we call the intertidal zone, where sometimes they can get exposed to the air.
Yeah. Has anyone ever eaten a sea urchin? Ever tried it? I see some of the panelists shaking their head. They can be very tasty. If you they're popular in Japanese cuisine. They go by the name of uni, but lots of other coastal cuisines and cultures eat them as well. And yeah, you don't feel like you want to. Yeah, teach their own. I won't judge anyone for that. They don't look the most appetizing with their spikes. But the reason I brought this up is that one of the ways scientists think that they might be able to bring kelp forests back and that we're interested in is removing urchins from a place before trying to put out the kelp. We didn't do that here. We left the urchins where they are. Up in Haida Gwaii, there's been a really successful multi-year study where they removed urchins without even putting baby kelps out there, and the kelp came back. And so there's this idea of something that people have called urchinomics, which is removing urchins from a reef and then growing them in aquaculture in order to make them fatter and more delicious, and then selling those and then funding kelp restoration with that. There's no examples yet of people doing that at a big scale, but it's a cool idea. And so if anyone's interested in that idea, I'd encourage you to read on it further.
I think we're seeing a fish here. Clay, do you know what kind of fish that is?
I think I missed it.
Does Averill know?
Oh, look at that sea star right on top of our bag. It really got to the top there.
Cool. I just saw this comment from someone about the sea urchin in Turks and Caicos, which is in the Northern Caribbean. And yeah, the interesting thing, so those sea urchins also eat algae, but it's kind of the opposite in that coast, in that ocean. The sea urchins started to disappear, and that caused problems. There weren't enough sea urchins, and so what's happening now is that there's too much algae, and that's overgrowing coral. So it's a kind of flipped situation where people really want to bring the sea urchins back in the Caribbean, and it's we're dealing with the opposite. We need to get sea otters and sea stars back to help control the numbers of sea urchins on this coast.
Yeah, but a lot of these things, it's all about our perception of the animal. Sea urchins are beneficial in some scenarios, and they can be eating a lot of kelp in other scenarios. And it really depends on, in a lot of these cases, it was human impacts that were removing sort of higher up predators from the systems, linked with climate change and linked with pollution, that are causing these food webs that have been in a balance that sustained everyone to become out of a balance. And so, yeah, it's not about the urchins being bad. It's about just the context and what was the sort of historical baseline. And in a lot of cases, it's been the removal of top predators that really did that.
Yeah, very true, Lauren. I got to see some other questions here. So reintroducing sea otters, I know that people talk about it. I don't know a lot about it. So are any of the other panelists able to speak to that?
There are efforts to be reintroducing sea otters into the wild, but it's quite hard because they have very specific social dynamics. So people are still studying how sea otters actually can be transported, but you can't just choose any pair of sea otters to put in any place. It's a bit of a lengthy process, but yes, there are efforts and people are trying to do so.
Yeah, and then the question about other predators that humans remove from their habitat. People are trying to reintroduce and bring back the sunflower sea star that we were talking about. And those were removed by a disease. It was a disease that was probably caused by climate change. So anyways, humans didn't remove them directly, but at Friday Harbor Labs in Washington, they're doing research on trying to grow the starfish back and reintroduce them into the wild. So I'd encourage you to check them out if you're interested in learning more about that.
Yeah, and we have tons and tons of great questions, but I believe our time is at an end. So I would like to say thank you to Clay, Lauren, and Grace, and our whole team here at BMSC. And thanks for everybody who came out to attend our event. If you have any follow-up questions, would like to learn some more, you can check out the Bamfield Marine Science Center website. There's lots of emails on there you can contact us at. And I believe Kelp Rescue also has your own website, but they're part of BMSC if you need to contact them as well. Yeah, the link is in the chat. So thank you so much for everybody who attended, and thanks to everybody who made this event happen. We'll say goodbye from out in the dear group of islands.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.